We are first going to hear Sheila Dow, Professor of Economics at Sterling University, and then we will be hearing Professor Duncan Pritchard from UC Irvine. But first Sheila Dow. Thank you.
Greetings from Victoria in Canada. I'm very pleased to be able to join you, but just sorry that I can't join you in person. And particularly since this means that I haven't been able to benefit from the other presentations. So please excuse me if what I say cuts across things you've been talking about already or goes over very similar ground. My topic is cognition and sentiment, which are two concepts which are very important for the market mind hypothesis. And I'm going to look at ideas whose origin we find in Adam Smith, but also talk about implications for the future of economics. So I want to start with the problems that have been identified with mainstream economics, which is the dominant approach to economics, what many people in society think of as economics, and dig down to see where these problems come from at the methodological and philosophical levels. And I'll be contrasting mainstream economics with non-mainstream economics, which is all the schools of thought which operate alongside mainstream economics. And to do this, I'll apply a closed systems, open systems framework, because this allows us to transcend the different theories within different schools of thought, but it also allows us to transcend disciplinary differences as between economics and psychology. And I'll then explore how Adam Smith provides us with good conceptual understandings to build on, and then I'll talk a little bit more modern economics and the problems it faces. So let's start with the difficulties for mainstream economics. These became very noticeable with the financial crisis. Not only did mainstream economics not predict the financial crisis, but it had great difficulty in finding an explanation for it, and indeed the explanation involved only marginal differences to the existing framework. But on top of that, there was moral outrage against economics because it was perceived that economic ideas had been instrumental in causing the crisis by encouraging the way in which the financial sector behaved. Now, mainstream economics is presented as an exercise in technical expertise, in other words, something that is quite detached from any moral issues. But it's become harder and harder to sustain this, and there's been a tremendous growth of pressure from young scholars challenging the mainstream and wanting to explore different approaches to economics in order to form their own view about which they prefer. And this is a movement which is much more strong than previous student movements because of the scale. It has a global scale, and because of its institutional structure, which ensures its longevity. The two main groupings are the Young Scholars Initiative, promoted by the Institute for New Economic Thinking, and the Rethinking Economics movement, which is organised by students themselves primarily. Now, in spite of all this, mainstream economists are doubling down on their approach. There's been debate within macroeconomics recently about how to address the real-world issues of applied macroeconomics. And the outcome has been to hold out the hope for a deductivist model which will encompass everything within macroeconomics. And similarly, behavioral economics has been constrained by trying to fit in with mainstream economic methodology. Now, the way we can classify mainstream methodology is that it aspires to a closed system framework. And that's the aspiration that I was just talking about, which is very explicitly articulated. And there are various general conditions for a closed system, which to economists are very recognizable as the characteristics of a general equilibrium system, whereby all the relevant variables are identified, the boundaries of the system are fixed, identified, such that variables are classified as endogenous to be explained, or exogenous, determined outside the system. And the way in which the endogenous variables respond is something that is known and fully specified by the models. And this means that the relations between the endogenous variables are known, or at worst random. And actually saying that something is random is displaying quite a large extent of knowledge. Now, when we interpret these conditions in terms of a real economy, we see just how strong they are, because what they require is that the components of the system, the individuals, or it could be aggregates in some form, have to be treated atomistically. Their nature doesn't change, the structure in which they operate doesn't change, the relationships between the components don't change, and are either knowable or random. In other words, there is both intrinsic and extrinsic closure. Now, most economists would find it very hard to defend the conditions put in this way as a description of reality. And yet, the way in which they're analysed requires that they be treated as if they conform to these conditions. So that's very challenging. Now, an open systems framework is one in which any of those conditions is not met. So it's not a matter of a strict pure dualism, open, closed, in the sense that there are different forms of open system, different degrees of openness, different types of openness. And if we explore the different schools of thought in non-mainstream economics, we can identify them with focusing on one form of openness or another. And indeed, if we look at mainstream economics, this is something that Deirdre McCloskey has looked at, in practice, in the unofficial discourse, they don't adopt a closed system. They actually use an open systems approach. But it's when we come to the formal discourse that the dualism in its strict sense really applies. But we know from mathematics itself that a purely closed system is not actually possible. So even though there's this aspiration to a purely closed system, it's not feasible. So it's not surprising that other methods are employed in practice, even if they don't appear in journal articles. By the same token, we can't have a knowledge system based on complete openness, because there would be no framework whatsoever. I mean, a system means that some connections are closed and others are open. Brian Losby's written very helpfully on this. So an open system requires some internal closure. It's just that the closure doesn't have to be absolute. It can be provisional. It can be changed for different purposes. You know, we won't pay attention to this aspect of the economy for this purpose, but we might for another. And it's permeable. It's maybe not completely closed off for our purposes, but we'll treat it as closed as an approximation. So partial closure involves making distinctions, categorization. And this is how I understand what's referred to as practical dualism, that it's not the extreme absolute dualism, it's just a way of cutting up reality in order to analyze it. Now, what does this mean for the understanding of cognition and sentiment? Well, these terms do have a wide range of meanings, and not only in economics, but in other disciplines as well. But roughly speaking, we can say that mainstream economics applies very narrow meanings, such that cognition means processing information, not knowledge, but information, rationally calculating. Sentiment, on the other hand, is something that is not analysed in itself. It's something that appears in individual preferences to which rationality is applied. The preferences themselves are not regarded as the concern of economics. They're the concern of psychology. When we come to non-mainstream economics, the meaning applied to cognition and sentiment is much broader and carries with it a lot of implications. Cognition is understood as the mental processes employed in building knowledge, and knowledge being a much broader concept than information. Sentiment is understood, again broadly, as the emotion which may be expressed in a judgment or way of thinking about knowledge. So if we accept these two understandings of the terms, the interconnections are absolutely clear, because both apply to knowledge. And therefore, there are very clear implications about the potential interrelationship between economics and psychology, where psychology is of tremendous epistemological importance for economics. Now, we find the origins of much of this in Adam Smith. He clearly took an open system view of the subject matter, that it was complex and evolving, and because of this, demonstrable truth was not accessible. It would be appealing were we to present knowledge in that way as Descartes did, but the Scottish Enlightenment view was that it was not possible. And indeed, for Hume and Smith, both of them, they saw all knowledge as being founded in human nature, and that's why they started off by theorizing about human nature. And this involved a foundational role for sentiment. For scientific inquiry, there has to be some motivation, some wish to ease anxiety or curiosity, just as the aspiration to increase one's income rests on the imaginative pleasure from having that income and what it would bring. And then science itself is built on a theory of human nature. The view of cognition was that it relies on a range of human faculties, not just reason, not just drawing on evidence, but particularly drawing on imagination and moral sentiments. And because there was no scope for demonstrable truth, rhetoric played a central role, and this is another area where Adam Smith made a particular contribution, that in order to persuade others to accept one's theory, one had to connect with what people understood, connect with their moral values, and so on. So cognition and sentiment are fundamentally interconnected all the way through. Now let's come forward a few centuries to modern economics and analysis of the crisis. Is a sort of classic case in point. And here Hyman Minsky provides what I regard as the most satisfactory basis for understanding the crisis. And the way in which he approached this explanation provides an exemplar of a methodology which is different from mainstream economic methodology. He used models, particularly diagrammatic models, but these were only designed as partial arguments. He resisted putting the whole lot together in one complete formal system, just as Keynes, his mentor, did. And the reason for this was because he was so focused on the fact that economies, societies, behaviour all evolve, and evolve in non-deterministic ways. There are systemic processes, but they're not systemic processes which can be tied down within a deductivist structure, because the context in which the processes play out is always changing. There's always financial innovation, for example, in response to new developments, to take up new profit opportunities. The state responds with new regulation and so on. But also behaviour responds particularly to the presence of uncertainty. If we have no scope for demonstrative truth, most knowledge is held with uncertainty, and we have to deal with that in everyday life and in financial markets. And Minsky analysed how individuals, or more importantly groups of individuals, adopt particular behaviours and particular sets of expectations. But he also emphasised the interaction with the real economy. There was no sense that the financial sector was separate from the real economy, because finance, for all it's taken on a life of its own lately, it's still the source of the fuel to facilitate investment, real investment. And so we have this interaction in the form of increased debt. We have the interaction in terms of the valuation of debt under uncertainty. And we have shifting patterns whereby for a long time reality might not impinge on judgment very much, and then the system is brought up short by being confronted with some stark reality. But I mean, Minsky pointed out that you can never tell what exactly is going to create these circumstances, which particular bit of reality is going to break through or when. But as fragility builds up during the boom period, it's bound to happen sooner or later. So people who studied Minsky were, could see what was happening in the build-up to the crisis and why and how it happened. And looking forward, I mean, not only do these issues still persist in the financial sector, but we see them in a different form in the climate change debate, because future developments in terms of climate, but also in terms of behaviour, in terms of institutional structures, are all very uncertain, and yet clearly action has to be taken. This is what, I mean, I talked about Smith, I could have talked about Keynes. I mean, Keynes' philosophy was focused on the question of how do we form beliefs as the basis for action. So what do I take from this in more general terms about the future of economics? Well, first, there has to be a basic recognition that terms and concepts can and are used differently. Rationality is the most obvious one, but when we talk about cognition, sentiment, dualism, these are all important terms which mean something different depending on the type of approach that we take. So some awareness of this would be of tremendous assistance to debate and moving forward and taking advantage of the fact that there is a range of approaches that we can consider to deal with the problems that are going to arise in the future. And this involves debate. If we have a range of approaches, none of which can be demonstrated to be true or even the best, it's a matter of persuasion, then debate has to be an inherent part of the process. And what I would argue for particularly is that given that socioeconomic systems are open, and since purely closed systems of analysis aren't even attainable, we really need to focus on the possibilities within open systems, ways of doing economics. So I'll close there. Thank you very much.
We have a second presentation now from Professor Duncan Pritchard, Professor of Philosophy at UC Irvine. So over to Duncan now.
Hello everyone. My name is Duncan Pritchard from the University of California, Irvine, and I'm going to be talking today about Sociotechnical Extended Market Knowledge. Thanks to the organisers for inviting me to speak. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. Thanks especially to Patrick. Okay, so here's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in this idea of the market mind that this conference has been convened to explore. I'm interested primarily as an epistemological phenomenon. I think taking the market mind seriously means treating it as a socio-technical cognitive system. That is, one that's tracking relevant facts in the world. I think it's also one that's in part generating certain kinds of facts too. Facts about value, levels of risk, and so on. I don't mean anything particularly postmodern when I talk about generating facts here. You could go that route, I suppose. I mean it in a much more flat-footed way, just as for example, a sporting body can change the rules, and that will generate facts of a certain kind about, I mean, think about VAR in a football game, and how that, generates, in a sense, facts about whether a shot counts as a goal and so forth. I think similar things go on when we have institutional structures that make decisions about, in this case, value, risk, and so on. In a sense, they're generating facts, but I don't mean that we don't need to construe that in a postmodern way, particularly. I'm primarily interested, though, in the tracking phenomenon here. So, cognitive system tracking facts of this particular kind in this particular domain. That implies expertise that's involved in the socio-technical cognitive system, which in turn implies a kind of socio-technical knowledge. And my interest in is, how is this to be understood? And what I want to do is I want to explore this issue through the lens of extended cognition, which is a familiar paradigm in the cognitive sciences. And drawing on previous work, I want to propose a three-tiered conception of socio-technical cognition and the knowledge that corresponds to it. The first tier, the lowest tier, is socio-technologically facilitated cognition and knowledge. Second tier is extended cognition proper in this domain, socio-technical extended knowledge leading to socio-technical extended cognition leading to socio-technical extended knowledge. And then the most demanding tier is socio-technically distributed cognition and knowledge. So this is more demanding in that it implies a kind of group knower in the specific sense of an irreducible group knower, group agent. I want to suggest that market knowledge, the kind of knowledge that market experts acquire, is often best understood as, at most, socio-technical extended knowledge. So not as the distributed kind of cognition. And this is, I've argued for a similar claim elsewhere in the case of certain kinds of collaborative scientific inquiry, where it seems to me that distinguish between these different tiers of socio-technical cognition enables us to see how the cognition in play often falls short of a distributed, in this sense, cognition. I think similar points apply here. I'll just say, I'm talking about market knowledge acquired via market experts. So by that token, I'm talking about genuine expertise, not amateurs. I'm talking about people who are embedded in the social institutional structures which are in play here. So professionals, essentially. Relatedly, I'm not talking about amateurs, but I'm also not talking about, when I talk about market knowledge, I'm not talking about people who are theorizing about the market. That's a different kind of knowers. We could, of course, call that market knowledge as well, but it's obviously of a more abstract and disengaged kind. I'm thinking more of the embedded expertise that's in play here. That's going to be my focus. Now, when we talk about the market mind, we can mean a lot of different things. I have 3 readings here on the PowerPoint. They're not meant to be exhaustive readings, and they're not even meant to be incompatible either. They could be. Whether they are or not depends upon what you build into them. But, one reading, a very strong reading, would be think of the market mind as an emergent conscious group mind, irreducible to participating subjects. That's a view. I think it would take a lot of defense. It's quite a metaphysically extravagant view, but it could be defensible. A different kind of view might be the market mind as a kind of group agency that's reducible, perhaps in a complex fashion. It's the agency of the participating subjects. It's the orthodoxy and certainly philosophy of group agency is to treat group agency as reducible in some way. So it's not, although it may be some emergent property of some kind of, which is properly attributable to the group, we can understand that without, bringing in anything, any metaphysically extravagant new entity. We can understand it in terms of activities of the participating subjects and so forth. So that would be a weaker kind of reading. But there's also a further way of thinking about the market mind, which I think is orthogonal to the first 2 that I list here, which is just to think of it as a socio-technical cognitive system. And then it's a further question then, when you think of it in these terms, how it interplays with these other conceptions of the market mind. And my focus is going to be on the third option. So let me say a little bit more about sociotechnical cognitive systems. So I'm suggesting that we should think of market expertise that way. And there's a reason for that. Is because it looks an awful lot like other kinds of cases where we have sociotechnical cognitive systems that seem to be structured very similarly. And many of these other systems are actually, I think, more widely theorized about and understood. Particularly the scientific case. There's a lot of work on highly collaborative and technology-dependent scientific inquiry. I'm thinking that the case I'll give here, which I think is most apt for our purposes, is that of high-energy physics, the kind of work that's done in the CERN laboratory, for example. It's been widely studied. I list here a famous study by Norsetina. And when you look at the sort of properties that kind of highly technological, highly collaborative scientific inquiry have, you've got yourself clearly a sociotechnical cognitive system, but you also have something which looks very similar to the kind of embedded market expertise that we find, at least in present day market trading. So, take as an example, which I think is quite useful here, high frequency trading. So Donald Mackenzie, who's based here, in Edinburgh, has done a lot of very interesting work on this. That kind of market expertise involved there looks very similar in structural ways to the kind of expertise you might find in scientific contexts like engagement with high energy physics. Here are some relevant features. Specialization of expertise, a very high degree of specialization. Epistemic dependence on the expertise of others. That's, in a sense, a kind of consequence of the first point, right? If you have high degree of specialization, then often you're dependent on the expertise of others in the sense that, you can't reproduce their expertise yourself. You don't have that capacity. So there's a lot of trust involved. Trust that they are experts, they are doing their job properly and so forth. Employment of complex technology. That's very clear in the case of high energy physics. But also, with high frequency trading. As Mackenzie points out, the actual trades, when we deal with high frequency trading, aren't actually done by traders. They're done by the algorithm. So when we talk about traders in this context, we're sort of taking a step back. We're thinking of people who oversee the algorithm, people who make decisions about distribution of risk and so forth, strategy judgments and so forth. There's a temporal and geographical distribution of the main actors. You get this in high energy physics. You also get it in high frequency trading too. Of course, there are some geographical limitations in both cases. There's a reason why many of the best high energy physicists are working at the CERN laboratory and actually based there. Similarly, in the case of high frequency trading, there are certain geographical limitations. As I'm sure you know, that part of what drives high frequency trading is gaining milliseconds of advantage over your competitors, and that can have a bearing on where parts of your operation are based. Because if they're based too far away from the relevant centres, then you'll lose that advantage. So structurally, we've got these scientific cases of socio-technical cognitive systems. And then when we look at the case of market expertise, we see that that's manifesting itself in a cognitive system that looks very similar in terms of its structure, very similar kind of socio-technical cognitive system. And, I'm not the first to notice that. In fact, interestingly, Norsetina is one of the sociologists of this who's made that connection. There are many quotations that I could give that would help support this case. If I had the time, I would give you a list of cases where people discuss this collaborative scientific inquiry and discuss the financial markets and make the connection. But since time is limited, I'll just give you this one quotation here. It's from Mackenzie, a recent paper of his. He's talking about dark pool electronic share trading here, where certain information about buyer and seller is hidden from each other. It's not a transparent form of trading, but that doesn't matter. And also, his focus here is more on actor network economic sociology and sort of the Bruno Latour type framework and how it intersects with field theory, Bourdieu, and so on. But we don't need to get into that. I mean, I think the general point is pretty clear about how these socio-technical systems have a bearing on the cognition in play. As he says here, trading is not reducible to human action alone. It is a material process that is shaped strongly by non-human actors, such as technologies, whether the latter as simple as the orthogonal stepped amphitheatre of Chicago's traditional trading pits, or as complex as the electronic infrastructures of today's markets. Okay, what I want to do is explore this kind of socio-technical cognitive system through the lens of extended cognition. The idea of exploring socio-technical cognitive systems this way isn't novel to me, but there isn't, surprisingly, isn't it, that much work done on this in terms of exploring the financial markets. So I think it's ripe for further exploration. Let me say a little bit about what extended cognition is. This goes back to Clark and Chalmers' famous work. Andy Clark has done a lot of work following up from this, and there's a whole research program now exploring extended cognition. But this occurs when features of the subject's cognitive environment, such as technology, but this can also be social, as we'll see, become seamlessly integrated into the onboard cognitive processes. And the thought is that in the right conditions, this becomes more than just technological assistance, right? It's a genuine kind of cognitive augmentation. So the thought is, not every time we use an instrument is our relationship to the instrument one, our cognitive relation one of subject to instrument. I mean, obviously sometimes it is. But the thought is, in the right kind of circumstances, if the instrument is appropriately integrated into our cognitive systems, then the instrument can become a proper part of one's cognitive processes. So one's cognitive processes, as it were, become extended. They now take in not just what's going on underneath the skin and skull of the subject, but also take in features of the environment. They become part of the cognitive processes as well. This is quite familiar in the technological case. We can think about how, often when you have expertise involving technology, there becomes a certain point where the use of the technology becomes so fluent that we start to think about the cognitive process differently. That is, we start to think about the technology as being a part of, an integrated part of the subject's cognitive process, rather than simply an external aid. But we can also think of social factors functioning that way. And indeed, we can also, in a more complex case, think of technological and social factors working together to become part of extended cognitive processes. So as it were, socio-technical extended cognition would be a subset of extended cognitive processes more generally, where you've got this specifically social dimension. Now, as I say, I'm interested in the epistemology of this. I'm interested in the kind of knowledge that results when we have extended cognitive processes, what we could call extended knowledge. Let me just make a few simplifying assumptions here to focus our attention. I want to restrict our attention to extended cognitive processes where the environmental feature in play, the relevant one that's extending the process, is undertaking information processing. That's important because there's lots of kinds of extended cognition which aren't like that. A lot of embodied cognition actually is like that. Hand use, right? If you restrict people's hand use, then their ability to gesticulate, then you can undermine certain cognitive processes, certain imaginative cognitive processes, for example. So, gesticulation seems to be a proper part of the cognitive process then. But of course, the hands aren't information processing. And there's lots of technology that might function like that. We can imagine all kinds of aids of a certain kind which aren't information processing. I want to focus on the information processing kinds. Certainly we can think of often technology, information processing technology, but also the contributions of others in a social network is usually of a kind where they're doing part of the information processing. And that's their integration then is a kind of extension, which is information processing extension. I think we also need to for simplicity, restrict our attention here to extended cognitive processes that generate beliefs. And indeed, more generally, keep things at the personal level, the belief level. A lot of very interesting work actually about extended cognition, how it plays out in subpersonal ways. In fact, Andy Clark has done a lot of work on this, connecting extended cognition with predictive coding. But I want to focus on beliefs because subpersonal processes bring in additional issues that I don't think we should be getting into here. We don't have time to get into here at any rate. So the question becomes then where we have this kind of market expertise generating beliefs through extended cognitive processes. We'd have extended knowledge, in particular sociotechnical extended knowledge, because the cognitive processes are at least partly social in kind, and that's our focus here. Now, of course, talking about expertise and talking about as generating knowledge presupposes a kind of success component to market expertise. One might think it prejudges whether, just how good is this expertise, a question that we might be inclined to ask, given, for example, failures of that expertise, failures to predict certain, the recent banking crash, for example, a few years ago, which no one seemed to foresee. But I don't think this is a problem for us. We can take the expertise for granted, but also recognize it might have limitations. And I think actually understanding the expertise properly is a crucial first part to understanding why it fails and how it fails when it does. How a global financial crisis can happen without the main actors involved not being aware of it. Well, that requires a proper understanding of what the nature of that expertise is. So I think we can talk about expertise here and knowledge without prejudging those kind of questions, but they're not our concern anyway here. Okay, so as I've argued elsewhere, I think if we want to understand extended knowledge, then we need to appeal to a particular way of thinking about knowledge, which has been very influential in contemporary epistemology, which is known as virtue epistemology. There's lots of different kinds of virtue epistemology, but the thread that they share that's relevant for our purposes, simplifying somewhat, is the idea that when one knows one's cognitive success must be at least significantly, but not necessarily primarily, attributable to one's cognitive agency. It's one's integrated set of cognitive traits. So let me just unpack that a little bit. The idea is there's an attribution relation here. What is it that explains the cognitive success? Well, part of the causal explanation of your cognitive success had better be facts about your cognitive agency, the manifestation of it. That might seem obvious. Your point of view, it may seem obvious. In fact, this ran counter to a number of other different, which I won't go into just now, different proposals about the nature of knowledge. So bringing this point out is actually, was at one point anyway, a novel proposal. What's interesting for our purposes, though, is that this way of thinking about knowledge, as we'll see in a moment, it creates the space to make sense of extended knowledge. But it also gives us a way of, as it were, differentiating between different kinds of social factors and how they might play out in our gaining knowledge. So this relates to this distinction here between the one's cognitive success being significantly but not necessarily primarily attributable to one's cognitive agency. So the question here is like, your agency has to play some important role in explaining, your manifestation of relevant cognitive agency has to play some important explanatory role in explaining your cognitive success, but it doesn't have to be the overarching part of the causal explanation, and there's a reason for that. On this view, the thought is we can account for how individual agents can piggyback off the epistemic resources of others. So either external factors like technology or the contributions of others, let's say through testimony, and how those external factors can play an explanatory role in one's knowledge acquisition. I don't cease to be a knower just because I got my knowledge from speaking to an expert. I have to be doing something. Gullibility is not a route to knowledge, but provided I'm being appropriately responsible, inform my beliefs via the expert. I don't just believe anyone, I don't believe anything, and so forth. Then I can count as knowing, even though the expert, of course, is playing some important explanatory role in my cognitive success. Same goes for reliance on technology, particularly where the technology is information processing. So that gives us a way of thinking about knowledge, which allows that there can be these external factors playing an explanatory role in one's cognitive success. The important thing is just that also you individually are playing an explanatory role, your cognitive agency, your cognitive traits. So I said this view allows for extended cognition, and this is what's sometimes called extended virtue epistemology. The thought just goes, look, when we talk about the cognitive processes that are in play here, these integrated cognitive processes, there's no stipulation of what kind of cognitive processes they are. You could add that stipulation, but it's not part of the view that there be such a stipulation. So the view is open to the possibility that there might be extended cognitive processes. And indeed, what the issue now comes down to is one of integration. When we make these attributions to what do we attribute the cognitive success to? Well, when a subject is using technology or relying upon the word of another, the question then becomes, to what extent are these external devices part of the cognitive process? To what extent are they integrated sufficiently such that they're part of the agent's cognitive process? If we think they are, then we don't treat them as external factors anymore. We treat them as part of the subject's cognitive processes, but where those processes are extended, they take in environmental factors. In contrast, where they're not appropriately integrated, then we treat them as external factors. They're just facilitators of the cognitive agency. They're not part of the cognitive agency. So extended virtue epistemology gives us a way of distinguishing between, on the one hand, a socio-technically facilitated knowledge, and on the other hand, a socio-technical extended knowledge proper. The issue comes down to whether these external factors, are they simply external factors? Are they non-integrated aids, as it were, to knowledge? Or have they become integrated to such an extent that they have become part of the extended cognitive process of the subject, such that when we attribute knowledge to them, we attribute it to the agent, not the agent plus the instrument. It's the extended agent. Okay, so I want to suggest that, I've argued this in some detail elsewhere, that when it comes to collaborative scientific expertise, that's plausibly best understood in terms of a kind of socio-technical extended knowledge. And I think insofar as that applies in the scientific case, then I think we should expect something similar in the case of market expertise as well. So let's go back, to high energy physics. We have these subjects in highly collaborative environments. Their expertise is embedded. They're in social networks where they're constantly relying on the word of others, on the data of others, where there's these integrated feedback loops in terms of how knowledge is acquired and then feeds back into the system and then generates further knowledge and so forth. When we start to think about those networks, when we start to think about the way the subjects are using technology, the way the subjects are relying on the information supplied by others in that network, it looks very much like there's a level of integration such that at least sometimes we have socio-technical extended knowledge in play, and not merely sort of the external facilitation through socio-technical means of knowledge. It's actually part of the cognitive process. And if that's plausible in the scientific context, then I think we ought to be arguing for something similar in the case of market knowledge, given the structural parallels. The use of the technology is sufficiently integrated, the epistemic dependence on others is sufficiently integrated, and so forth. So that takes us beyond the level of socially facilitated cognition and knowledge to the level of socio-technical extended cognition and knowledge. It doesn't, however, take us all the way to socio-technical distributed cognition and knowledge. Remember, that's the kind of cognition which involves an irreducible group agent. And in fact, I think there are reasons not to go that far. The knowledge that results from socio-technical extended cognition is actually individual knowledge. I think this is something that's often overlooked, actually. Because it has this essential social component, I think it's natural to think, but it's a kind of a social knowing then. Well, in a sense it is. i.e. it's the cognitive process that's social, but the end result is a belief which amounts to knowledge on the part of the individual. It's individual knowledge, not distributed knowledge. Certainly not irreducible distributed knowledge. And I think there are some studies which indicate that it's very important that it ends up as being individual knowledge. There's a very nice paper by K. Brad Ray. He's talking about the scientific case, but I think what he says, scientific case applies with just as much force in the market case. He says, although we might loosely describe what's going on in these cases as a kind of group knowledge, if you look more closely at what's going on, there are very clear mappings of individual responsibility. So in the scientific case, we might talk about the paper might be co-authored or whatever, but still the individual responsibility for the cognitive success is also manifests itself, in CVs and in grant applications and so forth. And Ray makes a very interesting point, which is that this becomes especially evident when things go wrong. So if a member of a research team is found to have been fabricating results, then very quickly other members of the team will start to delineate the different responsibility relations in a way which excludes that person's responsibility from the cognitive enterprise, their contribution. Ray says this highlights the fact that this individualized notion of cognitive responsibility was there all along. It's just kind of hidden. Now, I think that's broadly correct. Ray thinks this is an objection against socially extended knowledge. But I don't think it is. I think because socially extended knowledge is individual knowledge, it's not an objection against that. It is an objection, however, against thinking of these cases as irreducibly distributed cognition, sociotechnically distributed cognition and knowledge. And I think this is what applies in both cases. So what happens in the scientific case, I think, happens, the kinds of issues that Ray's raising there about responsibility and how it may be to some extent hidden, but it's definitely there, these patterns of responsibility. This, I think, is even more evident in the market case, particularly when there are financial rewards at stake. And in particular, when you've also got, Ray talks about when things go awry. Well, in the financial case, when things go awry, it isn't just, a worry about, scientific misconduct. It's a worry about losing large sums of money, being subject to fines, perhaps even legal redress from the regulatory bodies and so forth. So these patterns of responsibility you'd expect to be even stronger in the market case. So what I've been suggesting then is that what we have in the scientific case is a kind of social cognition which at least typically only rises to that second level. I mean, it's extended cognition proper, it's kind of socially extended cognition, but not yet distributed. We're not yet required to think of there being an irreducible cognitive agent in play. And that's, I think, part of the importance of the three-tiered way of thinking about these issues. In particular, to keep socially extended cognition proper, to keep it distinguished from a stronger notion, which is that of a kind of distributed cognition, which entails an irreducible group cognitive agent. So I've suggested that I think in the cases of collaborative scientific knowledge, when you look closely at them, it seems typically what's at play there is at most a kind of socially extended cognition, which results in individual knowledge. And I want to suggest the same should apply in the market expertise kinds of cases. Okay, so here's what I've argued. I've tried to give you a sense of three ways of thinking about the socio-technical cognitive system that we have in play here and the kinds of cognition that it might be involved in, the kind of knowledge that they might generate. And I've done that through the lens of extended cognition. So we have the weakest notion, which is kind of socio-technologically facilitated cognition. So we're thinking of the cognitive system as just facilitating cognition, facilitating knowledge. Stronger notion, which is extended cognition proper of a socio-technical kind, which is leading to knowledge. But as I've suggested, that primarily leads to individual knowledge. It doesn't yet imply a group agent. There are reasons why we would expect, even where there's cases of socio-technical extended knowledge, it not to generate a more stronger notion, which is that of sociotechnically distributed cognition. This is where there's commitment to an irreducible group agent and therefore an irreducible group knower. So that's what I've been trying to argue. Notice, by the way, as I said at the beginning, everything here is at the level of cognition. It's at the level of the epistemological ramifications of that cognition. Nothing immediately follows from what I've just said about there being, a market mind in the strongest sense. It could be, for example, that there is a market mind in the strongest sense, but that attributions of knowledge flow to the individual typically. I mean, that would be one conclusion where you'd have a stronger conception of the market mind and a weaker conception of the cognitive processes in play and the knowledge that results. They're actually, on the face of it, compatible ideas. And what that means is that it's very much a further question how one sees these debates panning out in terms of the market mind as a socio-technical cognitive system and the market mind understood more generally. Thanks very much for listening.
Wow, two fascinating and very different disciplinary perspectives on cognitive processes, its relationship to sentiment and to knowledge. Now, over to Orestis now, Orestis Palermos from Cardiff University to have his own take and then, lead the discussions. Over to you.
Thank you.
Just to pick up from where Duncan left the discussion, obviously it has become apparent so far that from a philosophical perspective, one of the most important questions is whether there exists a mind that belongs to the market, whether the market has a mind of its own and that this mind is over and above the minds of the investors. And that's an interesting idea. I'm open to it. I've argued for it with Duncan in some papers. The question is, of course, can we say that about the mind? So, for instance, this idea is a common idea within philosophy of science. People think that some scientific research themes can be best described as such group distributed cognitive systems or group minds. And the reason why in such cases it might be a little bit more plausible, or at least why people have already started paying attention to this idea, is because those are cases of well-organized groups where the members have a common goal, and so the members kind of self-organize and they want to coordinate in order to achieve that goal, and for the sake of that coordination they restrain their individual behaviors. And because of this restrained behavior, you get new regularities, and it is on the basis of these new regularities that they achieve their goal. And so you can see this restrained behavior as some form of downward causation that also kind of justifies this idea that, metaphysically speaking, really there is a group mind there. Now, about the mind of the market, the problem is that, this is not a very well-defined group, right? It's a very broad community, and so maybe we don't know. And I myself, I don't know. I'm here to figure it out. And so far, I'm just trying to remain open. Now, I have a question that is similar for both Professor Dow and Duncan. So Duncan, for instance, noted that in the case of the markets, you can only get sociotechnically extended knowledge, but not sociotechnically distributed knowledge. And he gave the example of high-frequency trading. And that, in that case, I would agree with him. But I do wonder whether, for instance, there could be other aspects of the market where you could get some kind of socio-technically distributed knowledge. So I'm thinking the cases of, credit rating agencies, so Standards & Poor's or Fitch or the IMF or the World Bank. Those are organizations that presumably there is a lot of collaboration taking place. And they engage in decisions or they make judgments about the credit worthiness of certain other agencies. So maybe, would Duncan be open that in such cases at least there could be some kind of distributed knowledge? So that's my question to Duncan. And then when it came to Professor Dow's talk, I read her paper with a lot of interest. She was trying to argue that sentiments are very important when it comes to the knowledge of the markets. And my question is, in many places, that moral sentiments, the kind of sentiments that Adam Smith was trying to also argue that play a very important role in the market. Professor Dow says they seem to indicate that there really exists a market. So my question is, does you think that these kind of moral sentiments justify the idea that there is a market mind in a strong metaphysical sense, or does it mean something weaker? And if so, what would that be?
Yeah, so it's possible. I mean, as I said in the talk, going back to Orestis' question, and thanks for that question, Orestis. Yeah, it's possible there might be other kinds of systems, economic systems, which are more closely resemble the market mind. But what I was trying to do was to basically present a kind of a hurdle, if you like, that any such system would have to clear, because it seems to me that when we look at cases that ought to be analogous to this, like cases of highly integrated scientific teams, it seems primarily what's there is individual knowledge. So even though you have something, I think it's genuine sociotechnical extended cognitive system. So it's more than just simply a facilitation of knowledge through sociotechnical means. Right, so I'm saying it's more than that, but still what results in those cases, I think primarily is individual knowledge. And that's because the patterns of responsibility that are manifest always trace themselves back to the individual. So the challenges then would be to explain why in these other cases, what's different about them, which means that you don't have these individual patterns of responsibility, and then you genuinely have a distributed knower. And I guess what I'm trying to do is highlight the significance of that last step, because it seems to me it's a big step. To go from there being a genuine case of socio-technical extended cognition and therefore knowledge, to the further step of saying there's a distributed knower, irreducible social knowledge in play. And I think that's a big step. And one needs additional reasons to go there. And it's not enough just to say, well, we have these integrated teams and so on. We have these. The technology and the other agents are integrated in a way such that you've got extended cognitive processes, because that in itself doesn't give you the distributed cognition, right? There's a further step there. So that's the thing I'm trying to highlight. And of course, I only gave one example. There may be other examples that are more. I mean, I'm interested in the case you gave, Orestis. We'd have to go through them one by one actually, and see what are their features, how do they differ. But on the face of it, each one you might say, well, perhaps structurally they have the same kind of properties. You've got a socio-technical extended cognition in play, but still you've got these individual patterns of responsibility emerging, and so still you've got individual knowers. The knowledge that results is primarily individual rather than social. So yeah, like you, I'm open-minded about this. And by the way, I think, as I said at the end of the talk, this is all compatible with there being a stronger sense of a market mind. Because remember, we're talking about at the level of knowledge. It could be that there's a market mind, so there's a kind of distributed cognition going on in some sense, but maybe when it comes to attributions of knowledge, the attributions flow primarily to individuals. So that's another way of being open to this. We can accommodate a lot of these thoughts about the market mind, perhaps, without thinking that we have irreducible distributed knowers. Right, so that again, that further step, I think it needs motivation. So that was kind of what I was trying to get at with the talk.
Orestis kindly pointed to some examples where this notion can perhaps be contested. One of the contexts which we have discussed earlier in the conference is a monetary policy committee, and specifically about ESG models and their use in delivering monetary policy. I wonder whether that might be another example as well, a bit similar to your credit rating agencies and to the actions of IMF, where we can perhaps start thinking about open and closed systems and the nature of cognition, knowledge, and and sentiment in bringing it to bear upon the questions. Sheila, any reflections?
Yeah, there's a lot to say here, and I want to start by going back to my initial point that there are issues of meaning when we use particular terms. So I'd like to make clear, first of all, that my understanding of the market mind is in terms of cognitive systems, but cognition which incorporates sentiment in a world of uncertainty. In other words, the way in which knowledge is gathered inherently involves sentiment, that it's the notion of separable rationality is not sufficient. So, I mean, that's one issue of meaning. The other issue of meaning is over the individual. And again, this goes back to some of the discussion yesterday afternoon about the nature of the individual. I mean, emotional finance literature is somewhat individualistic. It refers to individual agency, and it portrays actors as making individual choices and persuading others to make individual choices. And yet for many actors within the financial sector, it's more helpful to think sociologically about how these structures work and what motivates behavior, but also what provides the basis for knowledge. And this is where sentiment comes in. And again, we can refer back to Adam Smith and his notion of the individual as something that is inherently social. And so our behavior refers to others and refers to others' opinions of us, or even internally to the impartial spectator. Within behavioral finance, the impartial spectator is often understood as somebody who draws people back to rationality in a sort of narrow sense. Whereas for Smith, it was essentially it was the role of conscience. Now, I mean, there's a spectrum here if we're talking about moral sentiments and cognition. But to come back to the way you put the question, the Monetary Policy Committee may be portrayed as a technical body, but actually is implementing moral precepts. The idea that the purpose of the central bank is to control inflation, that this is separable from other things, not only raises questions of feasibility, but also raises questions about moral priorities. So this is where the moral sentiments are suppressed within this mainstream economic view of economics and finance as being technical, separable from moral sentiments. But actually ignoring the fact that these moral sentiments are fundamentally embedded in the way in which these organizations behave and the way in which individuals within financial organizations behave.
Could I just remark on the monetary policy examples? I think it's an interesting one. I mean, I think there you've got group decision making, right? So you've definitely got a social system and sociotechnical as well, right? They're relying on technology that's integrated. It has all the right features of feedback loops and so on. It's been established and run over time. So enough, I think, to think of it as like a group cognition going on of some kind. But it's also interesting that in those cases, I mean, these are minuted meetings. People have to take positions. Those positions are recorded. It's very, the patterns of responsibility in terms of those cognitive processes and how they relate to the individuals involved is very clearly mapped. So it actually, I think that would be a case that would fit the kind of, the format that I had, where sure, there's a sense in which the group deliberates and comes to know something, but it doesn't seem to be irreducible group knowledge. In fact, it seems to be a socio-technical system. There's extended cognition, kind of group cognition, but group cognition, which nonetheless leads to individual knowing. It's reducible to individual knowing. So I think cases like that, you know, they sort of confirm that threshold, you know, that when we look at these cases, you can have genuine socio-technical extended cognition without thereby having an irreducible knower. So yeah, so I think that case is interesting. I think actually it illustrates the kind of threshold that I was urging.
Yeah, it's a very interesting commentary on it. I mean, originally the original body was designed to represent a range of views quite deliberately. And it's kind of morphed a bit into emphasizing more of the group consensus. And we see a different way of understanding uncertainty here, that the mainstream way of looking at uncertainty is that if there's difference of opinion, that's a measure of uncertainty. In fact, each member of the committee may hold their view very strongly and feel that they're not terribly uncertain about it. So there's a certain amount of confusion about what's represented by the different perspectives, but it's a very public form of individual responsibility and connects very, very clearly to moral sentiments, even if it's not commonly understood in that way. Yeah, so I think that would be you know, I really want to think about that further. I was really interested in your talk, and I'm going to see if there's scope for running with this. Thank you.
If I could just pick up on some of the points we just made there, because I'm interested in potentially the contrast between the high energy particle physics example, the high frequency trading example, and the Monetary Policy Committee example, and the role of the system that's under observation by the group in the cognition of the group, if you wish. So in the case of high energy particle physics, basically you've got, you know, the real and the natural world under observation. In the case of high frequency trading, you've got a whole bunch of quant traders basically, and machines and algorithms basically competing for some part of the market spread, if you wish, with their own individual incentive structures, operating on certain sets of rules, either dictated by stock exchanges or by regulators, and obviously, you know, determined by the physical world with latency and so on as well too. In the case of the Monetary Policy Committee, you've obviously got the economy under observation, and you've also got a feedback loop with journalists, scribblers, if you wish. We were talking about that yesterday, and the political world as well too, which obviously has had an impact on the unfolding of monetary policy over the last, well, how many? Since 1997, if you want to think about the history of the UK. So I'm just wondering what in a sense, the impact of the system under observation has in relation to the evolution of cognition in this case.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out one difference, which seems to me is quite fundamental between the MPC, the group of particle physicists, and the market, which is that the MPC's decision can be reconstructed, and you know, I think as you've said, and you know, any individual can see where that decision came from. In other words, they can see what that decision is and why, right? And the whole world can actually, and it's exactly the same with particle physicists or a research group or high frequency traders, right? I don't think that's true with the market. I don't think that's true with the market price. I think you get a bunch of people together and they transact and they create a price for wheat, but they don't quite know what that price. Everyone can see the number, but they can't then reconstruct how we got to that price. And you can't guarantee that if we put the same group of people in the same room tomorrow trading the same commodity, the price would be the same, right? So that adds a kind of level of mystery to a price, which isn't present in the other examples you gave. And then I think you can go further and say that mystery is almost kind of it kind of there's something kind of otherworldly about it. It's something that, although you know rationally that you were a part of the process that created it, you don't fully understand what it is. And then if that price, you know, as any kind of investor will tell you, If you own something and the price completely caves in, it hurts you, right? And so as an investor, I mean, physically, it hurts you. So you're aware of this thing that you've just created, which has a potential to hurt you. So there's a slight fear of this thing as well. And it just seems to me that it's not the same at all. It's just not the same at all. And so this sounds to me much more, and in the sense that a group of people get together, construct something they don't understand. That sounds to me much more like a mind than your other examples.
Can I also just say quickly here that you repeated the word construct quite a few times, and I just want to say that both speakers were talking about knowledge, which is supposed to be objective. And Duncan, at the beginning of his talk, he wanted to, stay away from postmodernist ideas. But there is this thing that perhaps in the markets may be, well, should we be talking about knowledge, or should we be talking, because, markets create values and they create meanings. So I do wonder whether knowledge is the right kind of, and I wonder what, yeah.
There's knowledge in a price,
Yeah.
And Hayek talks about the distribution of knowledge. The distribution of knowledge in society via works via market. So Hayek talks about in those terms, and then there is the claim by mainstream economics that there is perfect knowledge or complete knowledge. So, and then you can talk about, well, perhaps they mean a different knowledge than the philosopher's knowledge, but at some point we just need to discuss with these terms. Just for clarification.
Over to you, Sheila and Duncan.
Can I just address the issue of a postmodern way of thinking about facts? I think there's a sort of an intermediate position between objective knowledge, objective facts, and anybody can think anything about the real world at the other end of the spectrum. I mean, the mainstream economics is built on the idea that there are objective facts and there is demonstrable knowledge, objective knowledge. But if the real world is such that can't be justified, then in some ways all knowledge is constructed. This is a sort of pluralist approach, which is justified by an open systems approach to knowledge, which is that one doesn't have to choose between the extremes, that there is a huge spectrum between highly subjective knowledge and the best knowledge one can construct in the circumstances given our real experience. And even, I mean, if you talk about the MPC, I mean, there is an element of construction in the minutes. I mean, I accept that it's much more transparent than the knowledge that comes out of investigations into market processes. But it's still part of that spectrum. And that might be one way of thinking about the different categories of sources of knowledge that we're addressing here between particle physicists, MPC, and the market.
Yeah. So what I would say, I mean, all three questions, I think they all come from the same, background, which is this concern about sort of the objectivity of what's taking place. I think one thing might be useful here. So you're right. Just going back to the first question, I didn't catch the name. When we're dealing with the natural world, there's a constraint from nature itself, right? Because in a sense that there's inputs coming in which we don't have any control over, right? We're responsive to them; they're not responsive to us. But even in the scientific case, of course, there are systems of knowledge which, in a sense, are dependent on us, because there's frameworks that we impose upon the natural world to understand it, and those frameworks, of course, come. They're optional. They're of our design. They suit our purposes and our interests and so So we have a kind of interplay there between, as it were, things coming in from outside of us, completely independent of us, and then a system which is in part up to us. And when we move towards the markets, as I said at the beginning of my talk, there's more, as it were, fact construction going on. There's more of the second kind of knowing going on than the first kind. I don't think this in itself is problematic, though. I mean, just take a toy example. I mean, think about chess. There's all kinds of facts about chess, which, they depend upon, it's a game. We decide the rules, right? It's our game. We can change the rules, So it's not like the world imposes these constraints upon us. There are constraints that we impose upon ourselves. But then once we have that structure in place, then that determines facts that are in a certain sense outside of ourselves. They're not just fiat, we can't make it such. And it's also true, even with that kind of domain, that there can be kind of facts which might be hard for us to make sense of. I mean, I'm thinking here, like when they have AI playing, AI, they say, I'm not sure if this is, I think it was true of chess, but I think there are certain kinds of games, they get the AI to play it plays it really well, and it starts doing things that we didn't expect. It takes us a while to work out what the hell is going on here. What is he doing exactly that's so good, but we never thought about this. So, there could be things that are hard for us to discern about the game. That reveals that even though this is as our structure opposed to it, that doesn't mean that, in a priori, we know all the facts, right? It just means that there's still things to discover about the structure once it's imposed. So when we deal with the financial markets, I think we've probably, we're shifting away from the kind of model like with the scientific model where there's these inputs from the world, which we have no control over at all, which aren't a matter of decision, more to one which is a matter of decision, and that changes it. But it doesn't mean that in itself doesn't prevent objectivity. This is what I'm getting at. Just as, facts about chess are still facts. Even though what makes them facts in part depends upon our interests, our purposes, and the very structures we decide to impose. I think something similar is going on in the market case. The very interesting case, though, is the one raised by that questioner who said that, that we can't, how the market makes a decision is something we can't even reconstruct in principle. And that's interesting. I mean, I'd be interested to know a bit more about what that means. I mean, I would have thought you could reconstruct it to some degree, right? I mean, if that is, sure, we could play the game again with all the same variables, and we might have a different result, but we get a result in the same vein or something like that. If it really is a mystery how this result is gained, then I think we would have to accept, this isn't going to be out for knowledge if that's the kind of fact that it is, right? Because then it's an incomprehensible fact. To know it is to have some grip on it. You have some way of tracking it, and that means that it has to be comprehensible to us. So that would be an interesting case. I guess I'm a bit skeptical that we really don't. It really is an incomprehensible truth that we're trying to get a grip on here. But if it really is, then truths of that kind would be ones which perhaps are not in the market for knowing, because they're not ones that we can get a rational grip upon. But even if that's true, there may be lots of facts in the vicinity that we can get a grip upon. So there's lots of judgments and lots of decisions and so on, and we can reconstruct these things, and that's all. It comes into the domain of rationality and knowledge. So that's what I think that answers all the different questions, because they all come from similar sources, I think.
Thank you very much. I'm Danilo. I'm representing the Young Scholars Initiative, and thank you both for the very enlightening questions. I have a specific question for Professor Dow, because I was wondering if you see the market mind hypothesis could somehow behave as Hyman Minsky would describe in the financial instability hypothesis, in the sense that we have the firms that under uncertainty, they start looking for profitability, and when they are looking for doing more investments, they start borrowing. And when they borrow a few, the problem is on the behalf of the firms. If they start borrowing too much, the lenders start becoming a problem as well for them. And when they start getting more euphoric and moving from a hedge to a speculative to a Ponzi position, the system starts getting overly euphoric up to a point in which all the expectations fall down, and it enters into a huge depression. And the market mind would actually behave somehow as a bipolar mind that keeps going up and down according to the cycles of financial instability. If you see that could be, I want to hear your comments, because I know you're an expert on Minsky, so I want to hear your comments on this. Thank you.
Actually, I have a quick comment to make, and that is because you brought in, Duncan, the question of chess. I am told that you can write a program to play chess, you can write a program to play trader, because you do not need to interact that much. You cannot write a program to play bridge.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yes, I mean, I think Minsky is a very good case to think about in terms of the market mind hypothesis. And just in connection with the previous discussion, I mean, what he emphasizes is that while the forces at work are not deterministic, they are nevertheless systemic, and that gives us a grip on what's going on in the market. It's not a complete mystery. You know, we can understand by by thinking about the cognitive processes at work, how expectations evolve in a roughly cyclical process, and the consequences of that for debt, for real economic activity, for financial fragility, ultimately. So, I mean, I think if we think of the market mind as a cognitive process, then that is I think well captured in the Minskian system. So it's but if I could just very quickly interject something in relation to the previous discussion, which is to think about climate change and the way that assets are valued in relation to the natural world. I mean, that is an area of huge uncertainty and cognitive challenge, which is a combination of the real world as an objective thing out there. I mean, a flood is a flood, storm is a storm. But the way in which these things occur also is a function of social structures and behaviors and responses of individuals, of society, of states, and so on. So although there are real things going on there, it's part of a much more complex process, which is not objective in an absolute sense, but something that we need to understand in order to value assets in relation to the real world. But that's not a deterministic process at all.
Yeah, and then on the bridge case, that's really interesting. I'm trying to get my head around it. I could see that you couldn't have a program which takes on all four roles in bridge or something like that, because then you know that the machine, as it were, knows the intentions. It's got to be hidden intentions or something to make the game function. But is the thought that they can't even have a program that as it were, mimics an individual player of bridge? Because if that's true, that's really interesting. Although I can't see why it would be true. I'm trying to work out why, thinking about bridge.
Process is what I meant, because it requires such a lot of interaction and understanding, in some ways, two different agents interacting with each other. Well, that's what I've been told. It's enormously difficult, apparently. But anyway, that's an aside. It's something to think about.
Thank you, Arnab. I stand here wearing my hat as the Chief Executive of the Didasco Education Company. It's a charity, and the charity has run a course in financial education here in Edinburgh since 2004 called A Practical History of Financial Markets. So we've been trying to teach something different to financial practitioners for a long time. We've taught over 1,000 of them. We're still waiting to see the practical results of our efforts in better markets. We haven't yet seen those. We run that at Heriot Watt. So we've been long supported by Heriot Watt, and with the finance and money from that, we have supported this symposium along with our friends in the fund management industry at Walter Scott and Partners. And we've also founded the Library of Mistakes, and we have one here, we have one in Switzerland, we have one in India. I'm pretty sure we're going to have another one within a year and two within 2 years. So we are doing something. But today is very important for us because we are beginning to build more resources around something we think is particularly important. And those resources are here from Heriot Watt, Arnab, Robbie, Edward, this house, Panmure House, and Patrick. And what Patrick has achieved today is to bring intellectual kindling into this room and set it alight. I hope the insurers aren't listening to any of this, but in Panmure House. And the Dean will be having a fit if she heard me saying that. But that's what Patrick has achieved here. What have I learned as a practitioner, really not as an academic? Well, two things. This is a huge field, much bigger than I had contemplated when I was reading Patrick's primer. Patrick's primer does a perfect job, but we begin to realize now how big it is. And also how difficult it is to do cross-disciplinary work. It's easy for me to preach as someone in finance that we don't do enough of it, but when you see the depth of each of your contributions and the ability of any one person to understand all of it, I think it's a huge, huge challenge. And that's why it's fantastically interesting, because it is such a huge challenge. So this is really just a very quick plea, because I am diverting you away from your coffee. Patrick has brought the kindling and lit the fire, and now we need much more flammable material. So if you remember nothing else about what I'm saying, remember an Ulsterman just asked you for more flammable material. Two forms, intellectual and financial. So you've got the rest of the day to think about where that's coming from. Think about your own role, but think about where else we can bring it from. The pieces are here, the fire is lit, and we can turn it into a bonfire, a signal bonfire, but we can't do it unless it goes on from where we are. So I thought I'd speak at this stage to give you another hour and a half to come up with all the brilliant ideas of how we build this bonfire. And now it's time for coffee, and thank you.